The moon of Earth has a more elegant name, born from the Roman pantheon: Luna. From Earth, Luna is a serenely beautiful object, orbiting quietly while rotating in such a way that the same side always faces the Earth. The other side, the far side of the moon, perpetually faces away from the Earth. And because of this arrangement, the Earth-facing side of the moon has been integrated into the myths and culture of human societies on Earth for our entire existence. The moon and its recognizable pattern of craters and basaltic plains has been an unchanging element of human existence for our entire existence. Since our earliest biped ancestors walked across the plains of Africa and looked up into a starry night sky to see the great eye of the goddess, the moon has been with us, watching over us. The moon is a shared treasure for all mankind. Poetic language aside, the question still remains: is there potential for life on Luna? And I mean real potential for indigenous life. I'm not talking about human life going to the moon, or terrestrial life that we bring to the moon on purpose or on accident, although I'll briefly talk about that near the end of the episode. The moon itself is believed to have formed after a Mars-sized object called Theia collided with a young proto-Earth. This impact would have been devastating, drowning the surface of the Earth in magma and throwing up incredible amounts of material into near-Earth orbit. Some of this material would return to Earth, but a lot of it would accrete into the moon that we know and love today. This hypothesis takes into account more of the known data than any other hypothesis, and it also helps to explain why the moon is relatively devoid of metals. Luna shares many characteristics with Mercury. For example, both Mercury and the moon have a small magnetic field, but they go about generating their fields in different ways. Both of them have a surface defined by craters. Impact events have shaped and sculpted the surface of both Mercury and Luna for hundreds of millions of years, as their geological and volcanic activity has largely cooled and died down. Both Mercury and the moon have virtually no atmosphere. This is a really important detail for life. Because there's no atmosphere, there's nothing to protect the surface from solar radiation. The upper layers of the soil are almost certainly sterilized, and thus devoid of any life. The lack of an atmosphere also means that there's no medium to trap heat, so on the day side of the moon, unprotected in the blistering sunlight, it can get extremely hot, nearing 390 Kelvin, which is more than hot enough to boil water. On the night side of the moon, it can get extremely cold, nearing 100 Kelvin, which is way, way below the freezing point of water. So just like Mercury, although to a lesser extent, the moon experiences huge temperature differentials that would be prohibitively restrictive to life. We can see here on Earth that extremophiles can thrive in extreme cold, or in extreme heat, but there's nothing that can live in both. The biochemistry is simply not flexible enough to stay alive when alternating between temperature extremes. Now, where Mercury still has a little bit of volcanic activity going on today, the moon doesn't appear to have that much volcanism going on at all. I think the estimates for the youngest volcanic activity on Mercury date back to around 50 million years ago. The most recent volcanic activity on the moon, however, happened about 1.2 billion years ago, with most of the volcanic activity petering out around 3 billion years ago, when the moon was still relatively young. It was these ancient volcanoes that created the basaltic lava flows that filled in the basins, which we now see today as the dark gray patches sprawling across the moon's surface. The other major features of Luna's surface are craters, and there's a lot of them. Because there's hardly any atmosphere, and hardly any geological activity at all, the craters are preserved in perpetuity, until another impact event happens and creates a new crater that disturbs or covers up an older crater. These craters cover virtually the entire surface of the moon, and an extremely recent discovery confirmed that water ice lies embedded in the bedrock, hidden in the depths of the craters scattered around the poles. These higher latitude craters, scattered around the north and south poles, have basins that almost never come out of the shadows, so they stay a chilly 250 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. The water ice that's hidden down in the shadows here is permanently frozen, assuming nothing comes along to disrupt the crater's morphology and shine sunlight where it hasn't shined for millions of years. Unfortunately, the moon is just too similar to Mercury to be a good spot for potential life. The lack of an atmosphere exposes the surface to radiation and temperature extremes. The lack of tectonic activity, the lack of oceans, and the lack of an atmosphere means that there's little to no chemical cycling that would support a biosphere. There's some geochemical cycling, but it's all subsurface stuff that has to do with various minerals forming, rising, and sinking in the mantle. There's just a total dearth of substances that life can use. There's just nothing there. I mean, the moon fundamentally doesn't even have a very wide variety of chemicals in the first place. There's some potassium and sodium and a little bit of hydrogen, but the vast majority of the moon is silica and noble gases. This is not a comfortable environment for life, and thus I'm forced to conclude that the moon has little to no potential for indigenous life. But recall from earlier that I said I wasn't talking about human life or Earth-originating life that moves to the moon. Well, now that I've concluded that the moon is very unlikely to have native life, let's look at that possibility that the moon can host Earth life. We know for a fact that humans can exist on the surface of the moon. After all, we sent a number of dudes up there to check it out, and they said it was pretty cool. It's not like Venus, where an astronaut would be vaporized into ash before he even made it out onto the surface. The discovery of water ice on the moon greatly improves its potential for habitability. If astronauts were to set up shelter on the moon, they could access the ice in the polar craters, and melt it or somehow derive it from the bedrock to produce liquid water. This is incredibly important because it means that lunar colonists would have cheap, accessible water in situ. It would be a little more challenging to extract the water if it was chemically embedded in some kind of mineral, but that's another issue for a geologist to tackle. However it's derived, this liquid water can then be used in plumbing, in hydraulics, and in cooling systems to mechanically support the colony. Liquid water can also be used in biological and chemical experiments, and most importantly, the colonists will now have a reliable source of drinking water, which is absolutely crucial. If humans establish a colony on the moon, then we're essentially creating a little enclosed Earth ecosystem somewhere on the moon. Within this Earth ecosystem would exist all manner of Earth organisms. You would have humans, but you would also have any organisms that the humans brought with them for scientific experiments. I mean, hell, depending on how advanced and sophisticated and populated this colony gets, there might even be pets, like cats and dogs and fish in aquariums. And of course, there's going to be all of the microbes that live on our skin, or in our guts, or in our hair, and all of these little guys will be coming with us to the moon, as well as all the microbes that live on and in our pets, and our lab rats, and everything else. Although, I suppose that when we're talking about life on the moon, this kinda sounds like cheating. It's not the moon environment that this life is living in, it's an Earth environment that's just been enclosed and transplanted onto the moon. Those are two very different things. And so, even though we can theoretically build colonies on the moon and infect the moon with earthly biology, the moon itself, with its mantle of silicate dust and its basaltic lava plains, is not hospitable to life. It's extremely unlikely that future explorers, wandering around the surface of the moon, would discover lunar microbes living in the sterilized soil. Although, part of me doesn't want to rule out the possibility entirely. The moon may have virtually no potential for life, but virtually no potential is not the same thing as absolutely no potential. There's only one possible way that I think life might have had the tiniest chances of surviving and adapting to the moon. I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out. When Theia collided with the Earth to eventually produce the moon, the Earth was young, but it wasn't so young that it was lifeless. The Earth had already undergone the genesis of life, and it was home to a growing ecology of microbes, like early primitive bacteria and archaea. During the impact event, incredible forces would have been unleashed, like extreme heat and pressure. But despite the ferocity of the planetary impact, there's a possibility that life survived and colonized the newly formed moon. For example, it's possible that microbes could have persisted on rock that was ejected into near-Earth orbit. So it would have avoided the bulk of the heat and pressure. It wouldn't have been engulfed in magma, but it would have stayed nearby. It would have stayed in a near-Earth orbit, and it would have been able to be picked up by the gravity of the coalescing moon. If this microbe-laden rock landed on the young moon, there would have been a brief period where Luna had heavy volcanic activity. It would have been relatively warm, with an atmosphere about twice as thick as Mars's atmosphere is today. These rough, but arguably survivable conditions could have persisted long enough for the resident microbes to adapt and become accustomed to their lunar environment. Now, I don't know what kind of food or energy they would have used, but if they theoretically could have stayed alive this whole time and evolved and adapted as the moon cooled and solidified, then there's a small chance that there might be evidence of them somewhere out there on the moon, in the rocks and deep within the soil. Now at this point, I should really emphasize that this is extremely improbable, to the point of being laughably unrealistic. I mean, this is the only pathway that I can see that might have allowed for life to reside on the moon, but as you can see, it's really stretching credulity. There's a million things that could have stopped this process from happening at any step. The Theia impact could have been too intense, and no microbes survived even proximal contact with it. Perhaps the microbes were just too primitive, and they couldn't survive their brief foray into space, or their landing on the moon. It's quite likely that they simply didn't have the built-up genetic variety, they didn't have the raw genome that would have enabled them to adapt to the moon in the first place. And even if they somehow did have the genetic variety at the time, who's to say that it's even possible to adapt to a proto-moon environment in the first place? Perhaps those early lunar conditions were simply incompatible with carbon-based, water-dependent, nucleotide DNA-carrying life forms. To conclude this episode, the moon has almost no potential for life. The hypothetical scenario that I just explained, where there could be a potential for life, is so unlikely and ridiculous that I might as well be talking science fiction. But who knows? One day, when we have a colony on the moon, and people regularly go out to explore the lunar surface, they just might find the lingering remains of microbial lineage, handed from the Earth to the moon billions of years ago, and hidden all this time right in the sky in front of us, just waiting for us to come and find them. That would be one hell of a family reunion.